All right, well, it looks like the hallway is empty out there, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming to today's lunchtime talk in science and math. We have another one coming up in about 2 weeks. Dr. Mike Waller from the HPPE program will be giving a presentation on the history of strength training since 1900. And the rest of the talks for the semester are posted various places around this building as well as on the web and so forth. So I encourage you to track down the schedule if you can. But it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Valdez, the Park Service, who will be giving a presentation on groundwater and dunes and so forth. So.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for coming. Like, I get to enjoy some pizza, and hopefully the talk will be okay as well. But I started working at the dunes when I was a student here at Adams State, and it's been a very fun place to work because not only is it a really interesting resource to study, but there's been lots of management issues where the science that's done out there and the data we collect have made a big difference in how we're able to manage the area and support our case when there's differences of opinions on how to manage it. So what I'll be talking about today is some of the hydrology work that we do out there. That's probably the majority of my job. And it's very much an overview. Like, I feel this talk's like a mile wide and an inch deep, so I'll just be covering, different projects and different data sets very briefly. But we certainly do collect a lot of data. And would it be possible to get some lights off? Or, okay. And the outline, the outline for the talk, first of all, I'll go over the geologic setting. Like, I think it's always important to understand the geology of an area, especially if you want to understand the hydrology of the San Luis Valley. Then I'll talk about the management history, both land management and resource management. And this will be very broad and quick, but it'll just sort of set the stage for some of the things that happen out there. Because sometimes managing land and managing resources can lead to conflicts. And when that happens, you need to understand your resources, because you could do a lot better job managing them if you understand them. And Great Sand Dunes has the dunes as their major resource, but why is water important over there? I'll cover that as well. And then I'll talk about the data collection programs that have been established there and the results and applications that we use that data for. Okay, so to start off with, you all know where the sand dunes are. Geographically, it's located in the San Luis Valley, which is outlined in red. But more specifically, it's in a part of the valley known as the Alamosa Basin. This is the flat part of the valley floor, pretty much north of the San Luis Hills. And I'll be referring to the Alamosa Basin throughout the talk, so that's the area I'm talking about. From a geologic setting, the dunes are in an area known as the Rio Grande Rift. The Rio Grande Rift is shown on this map as the colored areas, and it starts up by Leadville and extends south towards El Paso and south into Mexico. And the rift is important because, rifting is a process that creates the major landforms that we have, in this area. Rifting is when the Earth's crust pulls apart, and what's happening as a result of that is the crust is breaking up into a series of basins, and they're shown on this map as well, including the San Luis Basin. But not only is rifting creating the basins, it's also creating the mountain ranges that border these basins. And if we look at the Colorado portion of the Rio Grande Rift more specifically, this block diagram shows the upper part in the upper Rio Grande. The Rio Grande Rift is relatively narrow up there. Then we get to the San Luis Valley and the rift is wider. And in this case, the east side of the mountain is moving towards the east, the west side's moving towards the west, and that's breaking the crust up into blocks. And as that happens, some of the blocks remain elevated, like this one. That's called a horst. The blocks that down drop are called grabens, and along the eastern margin there's a block that's tilting upward. That's the block that forms the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. But that's the process that forms the San Luis Valley. So the Alamosa Basin right here is a large area that's subsiding because the Earth's crust is splitting apart. And as it subsides, the valley floor down drops. It drops an average of about 1 inch per century, and that creates space for sediment to be deposited. So this is a large area that's down dropping and slowly filling with sediment. And the valley is very deep because this process has been going on for about 19 million years. So if we look at the Rio Grande Rift another way, there's a couple of maps that can illustrate the shape of the rift. Like this is the topography. So you have the sand grays here. This is one block that's elevated. You have the downdrop block of the Alamosa Basin, and then the San Juan Mountains over here. So this is modern day topography. But if we were to take all the sediment out of the valley that's filling it, the topography would look like this. You'd have the sand grays, that wouldn't change much, but the Alamosa Basin and the valley floor would change drastically. Like there'd be a huge canyon over on the east side of the valley. There'd be a relatively high portion along the center under Alamosa heading northward, and then another deep valley underneath Monte Vista. And these features are known as the Baca Graben, the Alamosa Horst, and the Monte Vista Graben. And these are an important part of the hydrology picture in the San Luis Valley, because not only is the valley full of sediment, these sediments are also saturated with water. And if we look at a cross-section of the valley subsurface starting at the east, like near Great Sand Dunes, and heading west towards Del Norte, the Alamosa Basin is pretty flat. But if we slice down through it, we can see the old valley surface. That's the surface I was showing you in the previous map. This would be the Alamosa Horst, this high block right here. And then you have the deeper Baca Graben and the deeper Monte Vista Graben. And everything up above this Precambrian rock, this crystalline rock, is full of sediments or sedimentary rocks, which are full of water. So there's a lot of water in the San Luis Valley, and it's subdivided into different aquifers. Starting from the surface down, you have the loose sand and gravel of the Alamosa Formation, and the aquifer that resides there is known as the unconfined aquifer. Then we have a series of clay layers known as the blue clay layers that separate the Alamosa Formation from the Santa Fe Formation, and beneath that you have another aquifer that's called the active confined aquifer. And then beneath those sediments, you have some older sedimentary rocks and volcanic rocks, and that holds the passive confined aquifer. And in some places, like it's believed that the thickness of this sediment is as much as 17,000 feet. So it's a very deep aquifer with lots of water. And early in the 1970s, there was a USGS hydrologist named Philip Emery that estimated that there was 2 billion acre-feet of water in the aquifers of the San Luis Valley. So, that number may not be accurate. Like later on, we've learned a lot more about the shape of the basin and also the porosity. So that's probably a high estimate, and he also acknowledged that later on. But potentially there's a lot of water in the San Luis Valley. Now, one of the key layers there was that blue clay layer, because it separates the upper aquifer from the lower aquifer. And that layer's there because from about 3.5 million years ago to about 0.5 million years ago, there was a large lake in the San Luis Valley. And this is the outline of the lake right here. It was called Lake Alamosa. And it's shown here in blue. And the lake was a different environment compared to the valley floor that we have now. Like right now, the deposits in the valley are river deposits. But for a 3 million year period, there was a lake there, and that deposited finer grain deposits, which led to the blue clay layers, and that's important because it separates aquifers. And if you drill into the blue clays, wells will reach a pressurized zone in the unconfined aquifer, and water will flow up to the surface automatically because it's under pressure. And this map right here, the blue dots, are all the unconfined or the artesian wells in the valley. They correlate pretty well with the extent of Lake Alamosa and those clay layers. Okay, so that's sort of the geologic picture. That's why we have these extensive aquifers here, mainly because the valley is a rift valley and it's very deep. Now the movement to start managing the area began with westward expansion. Great Sand Dunes were first described by Zebulon Pike, who saw them in 1807 when he was exploring western lands of the United States after they made the Louisiana Purchase. And he described the area as appearing like a sea at storm, except as to color. And then another notable event was when Colorado became a state in 1876, because once it became a state, it started managing water resources. And it uses water law to do that. And the way it manages water resources, mainly it started off managing diversions from rivers and streams. It was based on a priority system. If you were able to divert water out of a river or stream and put it to beneficial use, you could file a claim on that. and have a water right. And basically what a water right is, it's a property right for a specific quantity of water from a specific point of diversion with a specific point of use and a specific use. Like in San Luis Valley, it's used mostly for agriculture. So we have land management here, and we also have water management by the state. Okay, and then later on, Great Sand Dunes was established as a national monument. There was a women's club here in the valley called the PEO, who were worried about gold prospecting at the sand dunes. They thought they were going to turn over all the sand dunes looking for gold. So they wrote a letter to President Hoover asking him to protect them. So after a group of Park Service employees came out here, they reported back to President Hoover, and they described the sand dunes as a singular freak of nature. And the Park Service likes to protect and manage freaks of nature, like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, so this fit right in. And in 1832, it became a national monument and was therefore protected. Okay, in the early years, like here's the monument boundary, these are the dunes right here, Alamosa's right here. The Park Service it was an easy job to manage the Great Sand Dunes. Like we're out here kind of in our own little corner of the valley, like we're away from all the developed parts of the valley. So not a lot was going on. Like the Park Service mainly focused on, on visitor services. They created highways out here, campgrounds, visitor centers, stuff like that, because they wanted people to come in and enjoy the dunes. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a big parcel of land on the northwest side of the park, the Baca Ranch, was purchased by American Water Development Incorporated. And they had a plan to create a groundwater pumping project that would have pumped 200,000 acre-feet of water out of their ranch annually. And then later on, they sold their ranch to Stockman's, and they came up with a similar plan. So suddenly, the park had to start worrying about managing its resources. Like this represented a major change to the natural system. The park wants to manage this area as a natural area, so what would pumping groundwater do to the park? And one thing that really got the ball going as far as the park needing to react to this potential threat was some of the groundwater models that these water development companies produced. This is the one for Stockman's water. Great Sand Dunes is right through here, and the coloring on this map shows the amount of drawdown that their project would have had. For Stockman's water, they predicted that they would lower the water table beneath the park by 25 to 50 feet after 300 years of pumping. The earlier project had a very similar result, but the numbers were quite a bit different. They figured that they predicted that after 20 years of pumping, they'd lower the water table under Great Sand Dunes by as much as 150 feet. So that's a big change to the natural system. And the Park Service didn't have much data for any of the hydrology out here, neither did AWDI or Stockman's. So that started a big effort to gather data out there so we could understand how the natural system works. There's also existing water development projects in the San Luis Valley. One of them is the Bureau of Rec's Closed Basin project. It was established in the 1970s and 80s, and here's Great Sand Dunes. The Closed Basin project is shown here in yellow, and its conveyance channel is the blue line right here. But it pumps water out of the San Luis Valley and delivers it into the Rio Grande. So we want to know if that's affecting conditions underneath the monument. And also, what's agriculture doing? Here's Great Sand Dunes. Here's the agricultural part of the valley. There's lots of pumping out there. Is that affecting conditions under the dunes? So we wanted to know all this stuff. And one reason for concern with agriculture is it does pump a lot of water. Like for this, Great Sand Dunes is right here. This is the outline of the Alamosa Basin. And for a study area, which is shown in gray right here, they've been calculating the amount of water stored in the aquifer there over time. And I believe the graph begins in 1976 and continues to 2012. And starting in 1976, they're looking at changes in storage. So how much water is going into the aquifer or leaving the aquifer over time. And you can see it fluctuates quite a bit. And then around 2000, there's a huge drop. And then it's been gaining a little bit since then with another drop the last couple of years. So we know conditions are changing out here. Are they having an effect under the dunes? So the first thing the park did was start a planning process. The National Park Service is a government agency, and they're really good at planning stuff. So they gather a whole bunch of experts, and it really was a blank slate. Like, there really wasn't a lot known about the natural system. There wasn't lots of data, but the results of this is the Park Service came up with a resource management strategy, and they defined what the natural system was, because we want to protect the natural system. And there's a cultural system, a biological system, and a physical system, and each of these have components. And the special interest is what's unique or special about Great Sand Dunes, like why is the National Park Service there? And for this talk, I'll be talking about the hydrology, which is part of the physical system. And the important piece of information there is we need the hydrological data so we can evaluate potential threats. So they came up with this model. Like they described the physical processes which led to the aeolian system, the wind-blown system, the dunes which are out there, and there's several components to that. And then there's management issues out there. And I don't want to dwell on this, but the hydrological sections of that is the physical part of the system is sand transport by water, how sand is stabilized by vegetation, and the evaporite minerals that are forming out there. And they lead to parts of the aeolian system, which include a deposit called a sobka, a sand sheet, the dune field, and various dune types. And then the data that, or the management issues that are related to this is how we interpret the dunes, like how the story we tell about the dunes. It led to a boundary expansion. We were able to evaluate potential water threats, and we're able to manage our water rights a lot better. But the real key to tying all these things together is to gather data on these systems, because then you can understand how much they vary from year to year, and if they're in a natural state now, like what is natural. Okay, so stream flow is important, or this is the part that why is water important at the sand dunes? Stream flow is important because the upper part of the Alamosa Basin is a large depression called the Closed Basin. And streams from the northern part of the valley will drain to this area. And as they flow to the area, they not only bring water, they also bring sand. And during wet periods, like the whole Closed Basin can actually fill. You'd have a 30-mile long lake, and it'll overflow and connect to the Rio Grande. And it's been filled during historic times. Like, there's historic accounts of this lake being filled in the 1940s and 1920s. But currently it doesn't really have the opportunity to fill because most of these tributary streams are diverted for agriculture. So it'd have to be really wet for it to fill these days. But that's important because if you look at the sand deposits of the San Luis Valley, not only do you have the dune field, which is right here, but this entire portion of the valley is covered with sand, which is shown in the yellow here. And that's all downwind from this lake. Because what happens is the lake, forms beach deposits, but it's a temporary lake. So when it dries up, the sand gets blown downwind and ultimately forms the dune field. So streams are important there. At the dune field, streams are important because we have the dune field here. We have Meadow Creek flowing along this edge of the dune field, and Sand Creek flowing around this edge of the dune field. And they'll transport sand from the upper part of the dune field and deposit it on the lower side. So the dune field has this crescent shape because we have sand being transported along the margins by these streams. And here's another view of that. Meadow Creek is right here. There's Sand Creek, and again, there's that crescent shape due to the transport of sand around the margins. Advance. Okay, there we go. And these streams also affect the dune formation along the margins. Like Meadow Creek is eroding sand along this margin and depositing it right here. And where it erodes, it's truncating the dune field and cutting into it. So you get some really big dune forms here. And where it's depositing sand out in this area, the sand's getting blown back. So we have a very big dune ridge right here. This is showing the sand thickness or elevation of sand above the valley floor surface. So we can see there's a very distinctive feature there right on the edge of the dune field. And there's another one there right on that edge of the dune field. So we have these large dune forms right at the edge of the dune field. This is the erosive part of the system. Meadow Creek is flowing at the base and cutting into it. So there's a really big dune form there that's about 600 feet tall. That's that face. And then this large ridge right here, which is shown right there, is created by sand deposited by the creek. So Great Sand Dunes is famous for having really big dunes. There's really big dunes right at the edge of the dune field because of the effects of the creek. Another reason why water is important is because there's a deposit out there called a sobka, and this is sand cemented by evaporite minerals. The mineral is a mineral called Trona, which is a lot like baking soda, and it forms out there because the groundwater is right below the surface and it evaporates away, leaving the Trona behind, and that cements the sand together. So there's an example of the sobka. Like that sand is hard like a sidewalk, and this is the mapped view of it, shown in yellow. So this is where the water drains to and then evaporates away. There's another sand deposit, the one in orange here, called a sand sheet. And it's just a generally flat sand deposit that lacks dunes. And it lacks dunes because it has shrubs and grasses growing on it, which stabilize the ground surface. So that's important. That's the biggest part of the system. And it's dependent on having precip out there. So during droughts, there's probably less vegetation, and during wetter periods, there's probably more. And since vegetation is stabilizing the ground surface, the amount of sand moving into the dune field is probably dependent mostly on how much precip we're getting, because sand has to move across the sand sheet to get to the dune field. And then there's a dune type out there called a Copas dune, or nebka, which is sand trapped by vegetation. And at the park, we have them along the creek, like along Sand Creek. In red here are some nebkas. There's some more along Meadow Creek. And then there's a bunch here on the valley floor, but they're pretty eroded. But these form near river deposits, because sand gets blown off of the river or stream deposit and gets caught in vegetation. So water is important there. Like this is an area where the Rio Grande used to flood into the Closed Basin, and there's a lot of Copas dunes there. Okay, so that's why water is important from a physical standpoint. Like it's part of the system that leads to the development of the dunes. But the Park Service also has water rights for surface water, and these were obtained in 1989. And we have them for 13 streams, and the little yellow dots here show where we gauge these streams. In order to manage our water right, we need to know how much water is flowing in these streams. And for some of these streams, we have gauges that are automatically gauged, like Meadow Creek and Sand Creek have a flume with equipment on them that transmits the data to a database in Denver. And so we cooperate with the Colorado Division of Water Resources on that, because it's their system that does that. We just sort of piggyback on it to get data for our streams. And this is an example of some of the results of that. Like this is a stream flow chart for Meadow Creek for the last water year, which ends in October. So this is the 2011 water year. And the stream flow is what we've measured is the blue line right here. In the wintertime, it's offline, so I project a base flow, which is shown in that reddish color. And then we have a water right for this stream. And the water right value is shown as the green bar, and it changes by month. So last year was a pretty dry year, and you can see for most of the year, our actual flow was below our water right. And our water right is just one that, it's a non-consumptive one, meaning that it's a water right that says, you know, the water has the right to flow in the channel. We can't divert it for use outside the channel. It's just an in-stream flow right to protect flow within the stream. Okay, so like a more typical year would be like 2008. This is the same type of graph for Meadow Creek. This is the flow in blue here, and you can see for most of the year we're above our water right. So that's more typical. So gathering this type of data helps us understand like where we're at with our water right. And we can also take that flow data and calculate the total flow for any of these streams per year to see how that changes through time. So this is data for Meadow Creek, and it's the annual discharge. And it's the total discharge in acre feet. An acre foot of water is about enough water to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And this is the average right here, which is about 4,000 acre feet. And our data starts in 1995. So 1995 was the wettest year with 10,000 acre feet. 2002 was the driest year with 408 acre feet. And you can see that it varies quite a bit. So gathering this data helps us understand the natural variation in the system. It also has other uses, like Meadow Creek, which is shown right here, is one of the primary recreation areas of Great Sand Dunes. When it's flowing, it's like a beach. And most of our visitors come from the Front Range, and they're repeat visitors, and they usually call ahead to see if the creek's flowing. And if the creek's flowing, they'll come, or if it's not, they won't, or they'll call and ask, when's the creek going to flow? So one year we tracked the terminus of this flow, because when it dries up, it goes towards the mountains. And then when the flow increases, it'll start flowing around the dunes. And so for a year, we tracked its extent of flow. And we also had the flow data measured right here at the flume. And we came up with two populations of data. Like the blue data is for when the creek's advancing in the spring. And the pink data is for when the flow is retreating. And the visitor area is about 10,000 meters downstream from the flume. So if we look at this chart, it shows the live flow in meters versus the discharge in cubic feet per second up here at the flume. So if we go out to 10,000 meters, in order for the water to get there, 10,000 meters, we have to have a flow of about 10 CFS. And once the creek's saturated, the channel's saturated, the flow will stay there until the water drops down to about 2 or 3 CFS. So just based on that, and people can look up the data on the internet, they can know whether the flow is occurring at the dunes. And there's lots of other streams that are measured out there by the Colorado Division of Water Resources. Like most of these streams on this map here, the streams in blue, have monitoring equipment. And here's an example of Cottonwood Creek, which is on our northern boundary. And once again, it shows typical base flow conditions in the fall and winter. And then you have a snowmelt runoff here. And then this is an example of a storm runoff from summer precip. But we also have streams out there like Big Spring Creek, which start in the middle of the sand sheet and just flow out, which aren't fed by snowmelt runoff. And their flow data is quite a bit different. Like if you remember Sand Creek or Cottonwood Creek, they fluctuated quite a bit. But on Big Spring Creek, it pretty much stays around 6 CFS year round. There's some variation in the data, but that's noise and errors. Another piece of data we collect is weather data, and we have weather collection sites in these areas shown in red here, and that's very useful for lots of reasons. One of them is it gives us the precip record for a period of time. It starts in 1951. The average precip out there is 11 inches, and we can see how it varies over time. Like the 1990s were pretty wet. They were mostly above average. Like the night before that, like it was mostly years below average. So it's been relatively wet lately, but the last few years, there's been a downward trend. We can also use the data. We have a weather station up in the mountains above Meadow Creek to predict how much water is going to flow in the creek. We gauge the water right here at this gauging station. The drainage basin is highlighted in yellow right here, and our precip site is right there. And this graph shows the amount of discharge in Meadow Creek in acre feet versus the amount of precip at this site. So here's our population of data. Here's a exponential fit to that data. And so we can say if we ever get 40 inches of precip at this site, we can expect around 9,000 cubic feet of water in Meadow Creek. And so should something change drastically, like should half this drainage basin burn like it did a couple of years ago, we can see how the data is modified or if that changes the runoff characteristics of that area. Another management issue is how do we manage these groundwater, the aquifer, because we definitely need a lot of data for that to understand how pumping would affect the area. So the Park Service has set up or has drilled a number of monitoring wells out here. They're shown in the red dots, and we collect data on those sites. So that way we know how much the water fluctuates during the year and from one year to the next. And this is an old map, like this is within the old monument boundary. Like since the monument boundary has been extended, we now have about 60 of these monitoring wells. We have an extensive network of wells where we collect data to see how the natural system's behaving. And we've also done some aquifer testing. And what that does is it lets us know like which direction the water's flowing, how quickly it flows, how much water's down there. And here's some example of some of the well data. Like this isn't really good data because there's some gaps in the data, but it shows how it varies. I think it starts in 1993 or something like that. and continue. So during the 90s when it was wet, the water table was relatively high. It dropped during the drought of 2002, and then it's slowly been coming back up, and then it's been dropping a little bit with precip. So it seems to respond to precip out there. Here's a longer term record. This is from, it's an area within the park now, but this goes back to 1972, and it shows, you know, the same annual fluctuation that we're seeing in the park. These little fluctuations are annual fluctuations, but it shows overall trends over time. Like it's relative, you know, you can see how it moves up and down just a little bit. But for the most part, you know, there's not a lot of change. It's more or less flat. There is a little bit of a drop in change, but nothing drastic. Okay, so we have all this data. The way it helps us manage the park is, there's lots of ways. One of them is in dune interpretation. Back in 1997, or in the 1990s, when you know, AWDI first came up with a proposal to pump groundwater, people wondered if that would affect the dunes. And there was this theory that was developed by an Adams State geologist that stated if you were to pump the groundwater out beneath the dunes would dry up and blow away. And that became very popular, especially with the Park Service, because they liked hearing that. You know, it was simple, it was dramatic, and it was something they could tell the public. And the press liked it as well, but unfortunately there's not a single part of that theory that's true. Like, it's okay to propose a theory, but the next step is to go out and test it. And you can simply test it by looking if the same conditions hold true at other parks or other dune fields, and it's not. Like, these dunes are stable. Like, here's a picture from the 1920s and in 1997, and the dunes more or less look the same. But they're stable because of wind patterns, not because the sand beneath the surface is moist. But groundwater withdrawal does have the potential to impact the system, because the way the natural system works now is these streams flow out of the mountains and around the dunes, and when they do that, like as shown by this schematic, they start to infiltrate into groundwater. And during a natural setting, like there's about 10 feet of dry sand beneath the creek bed. So these streams flow over 10 feet of dry sand, they fully saturate that sand, and then they advance. They move on to the next section, which they fill. And so the way they advance is by saturating the stream bed beneath them. And they can go all the way around the dunes on a normal year. But if you were to lower the water table, instead of being 10 feet, if it were 50 feet or 150 feet, these streams would spend a lot of time right at the mountain front soaking in, and they wouldn't flow around the dunes and transport sand around the dunes like they naturally do. So they would impact stream flow for sure. And we also have water rights on these streams, so if there's a project that could impact our flow, then that's something that, you know, can be an issue in a court case. Okay, another thing we looked at is the closed basin affecting water conditions under the then monument boundary. Excuse me. And the closed basin, you know, is comprised of 118 shallow wells that are pumping water into this canal here. It was originally designed to produce 100,000 acre-feet of water annually, but the project is designed with a safety parameter, like the project boundary right here in yellow. The project doesn't allow for more than a 2-foot drawdown in the water table at the project boundary, so there's that safety parameter built into it. And 2 feet right here wouldn't really migrate up into the park area. And also, you know, they're pumping out of an area that I showed before as a Sabka. The Sabka is a very salty environment, and so they've been having problems with their wells producing as much as they originally thought they were. So it hasn't produced 100,000 acre-feet of water annually. I think the most it's produced is around 40,000 acre-feet, maybe 45. And most years it's more like 17,000 acre-feet. So we don't think that the pumping from the closed basin is impacting groundwater levels under the old monument boundary. Okay, but when we did all this work, you know, we realized we started off as a monument that was just designed to protect the dune field, but we realized there's all these other sand deposits out here, and there's this hydrologic system out here that starts up in the mountains and ends out here in the Sabka. So the Park Service went to Congress with a proposal to expand our boundary so that way we can manage a larger part of this wind-blown system and this hydrological system. And Congress thought it was a good idea. Like, it wasn't that they were so interested in protecting dunes, but they were very interested in protecting groundwater, because These water development projects have been a hot political issue for a couple of decades, and people were spending lots of money in court arguing, for or against groundwater development. So Congress wanted to protect the area and also protect the water resources of the area. So in 2000, they expanded the Park Service boundary to this purple line right through here. And it included the acquisition of the Baca Ranch, which is this big block right through here. And parts of the Baca Ranch, which were mountainous, went to the Forest Service. Parts which included these big meadows and lots of elk went to a wildlife refuge. So the park was expanded based on the geology of the area, but the real interest to do so, or the driving force behind it, was a desire to protect groundwater. And because of that, when Congress expanded our boundary, in the legislation they also said that the Park Service will acquire a water right for underneath the new boundary to protect groundwater levels. So in 2008, the National Park Service was in water court with an application to do that. And we were granted, and the court granted us that water right. And it's the first such water right of its kind in Colorado and probably the western US. It's the first water right to protect natural groundwater levels. So it's the first non-consumptive groundwater right. So we have non-consumptive surface water rights on our streams. We now have a non-consumptive groundwater right for the aquifers beneath the valley. And the way we manage that is we drilled 10 wells on the park boundary, and we use data from those wells to establish what the value of this water right is. So we need to show the court what natural water levels out there are what are we protecting. And here's an example from one of those wells. We have 10 of them. This is well BP3, which is right through here. And this well is near Sand Creek and Big Spring Creek. So this well shows the influence that streams have on groundwater out there. So we started off making manual measurements through here, so it's just a series of dots. And then after about a year of that, we got some equipment done there, so we have continuous readings since then. But we still make manual measurements to verify that the equipment is measuring correctly. And you can see there's a very good correlation. So we're very pleased with the way the system's working. Here's another example of a well out there that doesn't show the influence of the creek, but you can see an annual variation here. It peaks in June, and it's at its lowest in about October. But again, there's a general downward trend of the data over the 2 years that we're measuring. And the green line is the average value for that well. And this is important because after 10 years of data collection, this average value will be the value of our water right for that location. Okay, so now we can ask, is agricultural pumping affecting groundwater levels beneath the dunes? And luckily, there's lots of wells in the San Luis Valley with long records. This is well number RG42, which is within the park boundary. The park boundary is in purple. And if you look at that data, this is the well I showed before, you can see the annual fluctuations, but there's not any drastic changes in the water level. If we compare that to water levels for RG21, which is right here, or RG39, which is out here, right in the midst of the agricultural areas, you can see that, there's a annual fluctuation, but there's these drastic changes in it, and some of the annual fluctuations are much greater. So I think that shows the result of pumping in those areas, and there's no pumping out here, and we're not seeing that same signal up here. We've also created a groundwater model. This is a computer matrix model which you can use to simulate the effects of changing conditions on the hydrology. And our groundwater model is for this area shown in red right through here. So it's most of the sand sheet in the sand dunes. And it's a 5-layer model. And basically it's just this simplified conceptual design of what the subsurface looks like, and it has 5 layers. The upper layer would be the unconfined aquifer, the layer number 2 would be the blue clays, and then the 3rd layer would be the upper part of the unconfined, and then there's various other layers through here. But this is a tool we can use to simulate things like what would happen if there was a water development project. So what we did is we said, what would happen if there was water development, major water development north of Crestone? What would that do to the park? Well, we did a model run where we simulated a project that would pump 100,000 acre feet of water for 11 years, and how much would that drop the water table? And the results are that, after those 11 years, like up in the project area, it dropped as much as 500 feet, but in the park, it'd be around 50 feet at the very northern end and drop to about 10 feet before you get to Sand Creek and the dune fields right here. So there'd still be an effect, but we'd now have a nice buffer. Like if we were pumping from right here, you can just take that bullseye and put it right under the dunes. So, having this or having acquired these lands does give us a buffer against groundwater development. We also asked in this model, like what would happen if you create a 5-foot drawdown underneath Sand Creek, which is right here. Well, if you were to lower the water table beneath Sand Creek, the model predicts that the terminus of Sand Creek would move upstream by 2 miles. So it's a very sensitive system to changes in water level. The USGS has also been doing a lot of geophysical surveys out at the sand dunes, and we're using this data to better refine our models, because what the USGS is doing is they'll fly over and they'll image the area. Like this is using gravity data, this is using magnetic data, and it shows us what the subsurface looks like. So this gravity data shows us that there's a huge hole, there's a deep part in the Rio Grande Rift right beneath the dunes, the park boundaries, this line right through here. So we can use that to better define the bottom boundary of our model. And what this map is using is it's using gravity data to look for breaks or faults in the subsurface. And if we look at the raw gravity data, you'll see some linear features right through here. Those are interpreted as possible faults right through here, and those are important parts of a groundwater model. So we're continually gathering data to better understand the system. And so that's an overview of the work we're doing. It's a lot funner to do it than to listen to it, but yeah, they're doing lots of stuff. So. Yeah, if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them. Yeah?
Why is it that the creeks that go around the sand dunes only move after they've saturated?
Because sand has a tremendous porosity. Like you could take a bucket of water and pour it into dry sand, and it'll go in about as fast as you can pour it. So it's flowing over, this dry sand, soaking in, because it's got this strong vertical gradient. But once it's fully saturated, the gradient is no longer vertical. It's no longer flowing straight down. The water starts to flow outward, and that's a much weaker gradient. So then water quits soaking into that section of the creek so quickly, and it advances forward. So yeah, if you're out there when it's flowing, like you'll see a big stream, and 40 feet down the bed, it's gone. It's just going straight down. Yeah.
Andrew, with all the testing of the wells and so on that you've been doing for the hydrology purposes, has there been a component of water quality testing as well?
I'd love to do more of that. Like we've done some age dating to find out how long the water's been, or how long it's been since it's fallen through the atmosphere. And because residence time in the aquifer is an important part to understand how quickly it's moving through. And what we discovered is the water in the upper part of the aquifer, the unconfined aquifer, is all 50 years old or younger. The water in the deeper aquifer, in the one sample we got from there, came back with an age date of 30,000 years. So 30,000 years ago it fell through the atmosphere. So that's been a major component of it. We have done some water quality on the streams because we applied for this state designation called Outstanding Waters. So we collected water quality there, and they all qualified as outstanding waters, so they now have that. So that prevents future degradation above them. And the USGS collected a ton of water quality data from Meadow Creek. It was part of its project called the Upper Rio Grande NAQUA program. And so it goes from El Paso upstream. And of all their hundreds of sites, like the Meadow Creek site was definitely had the best water quality. Like there's always an outlier on their graphs because there's hardly anything dissolved in it. Yes?
Andrew, and all those red dots that were all the wells drilled to take, get the water out and take the canal down to the Rio Grande, when were those drilled, and who paid for that? Was it some city that came in and said, we want to get some water out of here? Like, how did that happen?
Oh, yeah, that project was built in a series of phases, starting in the 1970s and finishing in the 80s. And it's a Bureau of Reclamation project, so it's federal money that paid for it.
Because they realized that they already had more water rights downstream than they could fulfill? Is
Well,
that
no,
right?
the concept was, and this was when water in the Rio Grande was being allocated among states, it's called the Rio Grande Compact. Like people looked at this upper part of the San Luis Valley and they saw all these shrubs out there and all this salty land, and they classified it as a wasteland. And they said you have all these shrubs that are just evapotranspirating water. And I think they calculated that the total evapotranspiration was around 60,000 acre feet. So the idea was they wanted to capture that water, put it in the river, and put it to beneficial use for people, was the concept. Yeah.
Andrew, you kind of poo-pooed the notion that someone had, I don't remember who it was, had promulgated that the dunes depended upon groundwater for some stability, and that if there was greater depth of groundwater, they would drive and blow away.
Right.
But isn't that concept somewhat true in that you got the greater depth of water, you cease to get such long flows on Meadow Creek and Sand Creek, so you don't get that sand deposition?
Well, yeah, it would definitely impact the streams for sure, and the sand deposition around the margins of the streams. But as far as like the dune forms themselves being stable, I don't think it plays a significant role.
So if you didn't have that deposition going on around the margins?
Well, the dunes wouldn't be as big, but like if the dunes were completely dry, instead of having that moist core, they'd look the same as they do now. Like, just an example, like, dune behavior, dune stability, like some dunes migrate over time. Some dunes just stay in the same place and grow vertically. And, there's dunes in Southern California that are completely dry, and they're growing vertically and just as stable as these. There's dunes that are a lot wetter than Great Sand Dunes, like Oregon dunes or the coastal dunes on Lake Michigan that are a lot wetter, yet they migrate. And the key factor there is, these dunes are deposited by the wind. So if the wind always blows in one direction, the sand's always going over the dunes in the same direction, so they'll migrate. If the wind blows in multiple directions, then the dunes are sort of going to stay in the same place, oscillate back and forth, and grow vertically. And the sand surface is almost always dry, so it doesn't matter if they're wet, like a foot or two down. As long as the surface is dry, the sand's going to blow. Like sand moisture plays an important role along beaches because you have waves going up and down it and you create a wetting front. So you don't have a lot of sand movement where it's wetted, but above that you start to get sand movement where the sand's dry and you get dunes developing. So in cases like that, moisture plays an important role, but it's because the surface is moist. Yeah?
What causes the ebb and flow movement of Meadow Creek when you're out there? It really flows?
The waves? Oh yeah, that's a rare phenomenon called surge flow. And basically what's happening is that stream has a steep channel, and so the flow conditions are what's called supercritical flow. That means the water's flowing faster than a wave will travel through water. So it's sort of like supersonic flow for an airplane. And when that happens, like the characteristics of the flow, or the dynamics change. Like when you have subcritical flow, like you get like these little bed forms called ripple marks forming. When it's supercritical flow, there's sort of a pressure condition that creates these mounds called anti-dunes. So if you're out there, you'll see these mounds forming up in the water and then they drop. And these mounds form up, they increase the amount of water stored in that area, and then they drop and a little wave is created and it goes by. And since the channel is so smooth, that wave stays intact and it just accelerates down the channel. So it's having a smooth sandy channel with fast flowing water. Oh, it is. And like the biggest I've ever seen the waves are a foot high, and when it's that big, like little kids can body surf in it. So it is like a beach. Yeah.
So Andrew, we've only lived here 23 years, but I cannot recall ever having seen that much water out of the dunes. When was that picture taken?
Oh, yeah, like this isn't an incredible amount of water. It's just that it's flowing into some depressions forming ponds. So yeah, that would have probably been a June picture, probably in the 90s. The 90s were pretty wet, but that can happen whenever. Like sometimes the streams will flow into the dunes and then depressions out there fill. So it's a very migrating stream. So wherever it goes, it usually runs into a depression somewhere.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.